Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And yeah, the book was published on Monday officially. And so this is the first book launch. We're doing a few book launches in different kind of universities and NGOs, and we're doing a kind of a big one next week, which you're all invited to. Helen Clark will be speaking along with Lisa John from Civicus and Hannah Ryder from Development Reimagined. And it will be hosted by Anton, who's hopefully on this call, who's with Equal International, that's been working very closely with me on this. You'll notice that I'm Scottish from my accent. Obviously not, but my name is Glennie. So the observant ones of you will have noticed that I am actually Scottish. My grandfather's dad was born in Aberdeen, it turns out. And then Gail Hurley, with whom I wrote much of this book, but then who had to kind of work on other stuff and so couldn't finish it with me, is also Scottish. So it turns out this is really a Scottish production. Anton, who I've worked very closely with this on as well, says that he's half Scottish, although you wouldn't know that from his South African accent. But so it does turn out that this is a Scottish production. Let me see if I can, here we are. Okay, so I published the book 12 years ago now. This latest one has taken me 8 years to write, if you can believe that, and there's been a hell of a lot of consultation over that time. I published this book called Aid in Africa, Getting It Right. But the publisher said, if you really want to sell a book, you can't give it that boring title. So we ended up calling it The Trouble with Aid, Why Less Could Mean More for Africa, which is a far more provocative title, and everyone thought I was hugely anti-aid, which I was to some extent. But let me explain the difference, as I see it, between the moment then, which was just coming out of Gleneagles, another really important Scottish moment, and the moment now. In 2008, we needed to pressurize the major powers to look beyond aid and to stop using aid as this kind of sop to not do the things that they needed to do on climate change, on trade, on fair investment, on the arms trade, on a whole bunch of stuff that actually were more important at the time than just perpetuating the aid story. Also, it was trying to recognize the critique of aid that was so strong, especially on the African continent, but across the world. And that book, just like this one, is just me trying to articulate what so many people have told me, and I'm sure tell you, the problems with aid, and yet the continued necessity for large amounts of concessional public finance to support the things we care about, both at the national level in poorer countries and also increasingly global public goods and those SDG style new objectives that we all now rally around. So how do you manage that conundrum? That's fundamentally what I've tried to do with this book. How do you manage that conundrum? On the one hand, we need to end this kind of neo-colonial, post-colonial, patronizing, white savior aid project, which whenever I give this presentation in the South, it's just applauded for that reason. That has to come to an end. It's the 21st century. And yet at the same time, we can't allow the end of the redistributive impulse internationally, which aid at the moment embodies, the importance of working together financially as well as in other ways. And as I said, the increased need to finance a whole range of global public goods that are well beyond what was envisaged when the aid approach was developed. So that's what the future of aid, global public investment, tries to do. I don't like to blow my own trumpet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow other people to blow it for me, if that's okay. There's just a few quotes. There are actually loads of quotes. So this is probably too many, but I think it is helpful to hear in other people's words why they think that this is kind of the right approach to go for. Helen Clark said, the global public investment approach is our best bet for modernizing international public finance for the 21st century. Homi Karas, who many of you will know, basically wrote the the draft of the SDGs, working with David Cameron and that committee. With COVID-19 underlining the inequalities and unsustainability of the current structure of development finance, big new ideas are needed. That's what this book provides. Lisa John, who is the Secretary General of Civicus, one of the most important alliances of NGOs and civil society in the world. I'm so excited by this book. Funnily enough, that was an email she sent to me, and I said, can I use it on the book? And she said, go for it. I'm so excited by this book. It's the first really inspired take on the changes we need to make in the aid and global development system I've seen this year. Rethinking aid as global public investment is critical if we are to secure our undeniably interdependent future. I've got a couple more of these. The concept of GPI, this is Harpinder Colacott, who runs Development Initiatives, which is a British think tank. The concept of GPI comes at the right time, when we urgently need new ideas to shape the future of global but was also the Minister of Health in Mozambique. Global public investment is a potential rallying point as we plan ahead how to reconstruct the socio-economic fabric after the pandemic. David McNair, who is currently running global policy at the One campaign, this book articulates, I really like this quote, this book articulates what many intuitively feel but few say out loud, that aid needs reformed, increased and maintained for the long term. Not charity, but smart investment in a more just and sustainable world. And I think everyone knows this. Everyone who works in our sector knows this. But it's hard to put together a plan of what next, a believable, realistic plan of what next. And I hope that that's what this book does. And then finally, and I like this one as well, because it talks about my ability to write, based on, which is always nice, based on scholarly reviews and dialogue, the future of aid, global public investment, is a demonstration of a rare skill in academic author, the ability to combine fairly dense ideas with engaging prose to make the text accessible to a broad audience. So that's the reason, that's the final one where you should actually buy the book rather than just generally listen to this talk. I will spare you any more, and I apologize, but I do think it's useful, not just to hear me saying how good the book is, but maybe a few other people as well. There is growing momentum behind this idea. We've literally just come off a call with 20 or so leading thinkers from around the world who came together in an expert working group on global public investment. And you can see a few of the organizations they represent there, from UNCTAD to NORAD, the Norwegian agency, to the Gates Foundation, to UNAIDS, to Partners in Health, Civicus, and others, OECD there as well. And just to name drop, I think it was a couple of days ago, we were on the phone to the most senior advisor of George Soros, and the day before that, we were on the phone to one of the senior advisors of Bill Gates, just to say that this idea is gaining really critical momentum. And the first time I always say this, the first time I presented this kind of idea was about 8 years ago at a meeting at ODI where I was working. And it's not an exaggeration to say that not only was there kind of baffled silence as I finished my presentation, I think I heard a snigger at the back. And the overall reaction was a kind of, well, thanks for your kind of crazy wacko idea. Now, should we move on to something a bit more serious? And that has shifted totally now, whereby the really serious players in this sector and beyond the sector, because I frame this as the future of aid, but it's much more than that, are backing this and instinctively get this, not just in the South, where everyone's always got this, but increasingly in the global North as well. And the question, therefore, is why? And some of those quotes that you heard me read out just now referred to COVID, the pandemic. And that is one of the most important reasons why today, compared to a year ago, there's a huge amount of momentum behind this. COVID has highlighted that our current approach can't meet global challenges. We already had the SDGs, we've had them for 5 years, but we didn't really properly think we were what was required to meet them, I don't know. COVID has really brought home that health is a global issue, and and therefore also that global public goods in general need resourcing. It's also, of course, hit public spending in the North, in the rich world. So the short-term trends embodied by the decision last week by the UK government to cut aid are poor for ODA. Importantly, the long-term trends also look odd, because the whole point of ODA is that it comes to an end. And so-called middle-income countries are set to graduate from aid. So not only does there seem to be less money in the pot, but the whole theory of aid is that it needs to come to an end. And you'll remember David McNair's quote, another Scot, or is he Irish, saying we need to end this idea that aid is impermanent, that aid is temporary. It needs to be a permanent complement on the finance landscape. I also note here that we have weak international cooperation, not for lack of will, but for lack of an appropriate structure, and that southern countries continue to be excluded in global responses. And you see that in the replenishments, you see that in the way that the 20 or 30 rich country governments sit away in Paris discussing the future of aid, as if somehow they should manage what ODA is. Everyone knows that it's nonsense. It's 2021 almost. And yet it still happens. And there is this kind of feeling that now finally we can break through that. So this is a reference to the discussions to finance the SDGs, which took place in Addis Ababa in 2015. And you remember that phrase, billions to trillions, this World Bank report that came out and said billions to trillions. And what I think is notable from that meeting is that everyone talked about the importance of increasing domestic public spending, domestic resources, which of course is true. Everyone talked about the importance of private finance and investment, of increasing philanthropy, the focus on remittances. All of those were central to the future and financing the SDGs. But somehow there is this huge kind of confusion about the future of international public finance. Yes, we need it. We always mention it in the reports. We need to meet 0.7, but on the sidelines, people will say, aid, it's so irrelevant, it's so small. It's not necessary anymore. It will come to an end. We've ended it pretty much in Latin America. A lot of countries in Asia are graduating. You can see a lot of Africa is graduating. So it's kind of in its end days. And soon we'll go back to a situation where simply there is no significant redistribution of public money across the world. And no significant spending on global public goods, because where will it come from? But that whole approach has been challenged in the really groundbreaking new paradigm of the SDGs, which for me transformed the way that we think about development. Whereas Donald Kaberuka and many others, I could have used anyone for this quote, the classic way of understanding aid is that it's, as Kaberuka says, it's not successful unless it has a sell-by date. If aid does not stop, it will have failed. That's what we were all brought up to believe, right? Our job is to do ourselves out of a job. That's what all charities say, and I've worked in a number of them. That's what we all think, have thought. And I think it's time to challenge that. Our job is not to do ourselves out of a job. And the point of international public finance is not that it comes to an end. We're at the beginning of something. And that is summed up by what Adolf Klokeles, who used to run the German aid agency, says. Development only really begins when extreme poverty is eradicated. That turns the whole stuff that I was taught on its head. It's not just about eradicating extreme poverty and we all leave and go back to Scotland. But once we eradicate extreme poverty, that's the first step. There's so much more to do, and that's what the SDGs emphasize. Paul Collier, very influential economist, and he's back in kind of influence at the DFID, at the FCDO at the moment. He said there's basically no role for international development cooperation in middle-income countries. That's the aid paradigm for you. That's a summary of it. And yet many people, including this guy who used to run research at the World Bank, he said, is it not time for those arcane income thresholds for, quotes, graduating from, quotes, low income status to be laid to rest? They're meaningless, they're arbitrary. Actually, they're incredibly stingy. And I don't think they would be acceptable in Europe. And yet somehow we still say to countries like Vietnam, to countries like Ghana, I'm currently in Nigeria, oh, well, you're almost at the place where we don't need to help anymore because look, there's only 15% extreme poverty. You're just about struggling by. I don't think that's the way that we ought to operate in the 21st century. So this proposal, I'm going to come on to it, there's a lot of throat clearing, and Geraldine, please do tell me and hold up a red flag if I waffle on. Because I think it's really one of the beautiful things about this concept is it's the beginning stage, and we do want to co-create it. And we want to hear from people about how to improve it and take it on. But this proposal for global public investment seeks to clarify the role of concessional international public finance in the 21st century, respond to the higher ambitions set out in the SDGs, reflect the emergence of providers from the global south, lead to increases, crucially lead to increases of financial commitments globally, enhance impact and effectiveness, democratize governance and accountability, which is still so undemocratic, garner legitimacy from civil society. The parts of civil society in the south which have been skeptical about this idea, people have been really, really positive about it. The parts that have been skeptical are those parts that just don't think any kind of international public finance from the north is ever going to work because they've had such poor experiences. So there are parts of the world that really are so kind of scarred by aid that they don't want anything to do with anything that looks like it. But the majority of people, as I said at the beginning, recognize the need for large-scale international funds, and yet also the need to move on from that old-fashioned aid paradigm. Emphasize global benefits, use language that's modern and non-paternalist, incredibly important, even though we always kind of leave it till last, and secure strong and stable support from critical constituencies. So the book begins with an analogy, and with two analogies actually. And it looks at public spending at the national level, and it looks at public spending at the regional level, particularly the EU. And it says, basically, why can't we think the same at the global level? So in the UK, we call it public spending. We don't say it's charity. It's still a relatively new aspect of the economy, and this is, I think, what people have to recognize. We need to read our history. At the turn of the 19th, 20th century, at the turn of the, would it be the turn of the 20th century? As we move from the 1800s to the 1900s, public spending in Britain was about 15% of GDP. By the time we come to the end of the Second World War, it was 30 or 40%. It's now around 30 or 40%. That is huge, and it would never have been predicted if you asked someone in 1900 that we would be ramping up money for public health, ramping up money for public roads, public education. It was all basically spent on the military and other things. And I believe that that's where we're at with the global situation as well. We're at the beginning of something that we need to continue to develop over the 21st century rather than at the end of something. We don't put an end date on public spending. We don't say, oh, Liverpool, you've graduated. When you reach a particular stage, you move to the next stage. This is what progress is. And there are redistributive elements, but it's not only about eradicating poverty. Clearly not. It's about parks, it's about museums, it's about infrastructure, it's about digital, it's about supporting business. And yes, absolutely, it's also about welfare and responding to inequality. And then at the European level, the aim of the billions of euros that are spent every year transferred from wealthier parts of the union to less wealthy parts of the union. The aim is convergence. It's not to eradicate poverty in Poland, not to eradicate poverty in Spain and Italy, which have been net recipients for most of their membership of the EU, and clearly Eastern Europe is still net recipient. It's about converging with a living standard that we as a union think is appropriate. Why can't we apply that principle to the world? Why is it only appropriate for Europe? Why is Europe about convergence to a living standard, but aid about eradicating extreme poverty and then walking away? Billions are transferred annually, mostly grants. And this is the crucial bit. Every country contributes and every country receives. But poorer countries make a net gain. They're net recipients. So whereas we maintain this paradigm, actually a fallacious paradigm today, but this paradigm in aid, whereby you have donors on one hand, recipients on the other, it's not true, and we'll come on to that. The European Union does something totally different, and so does, at the national level, something totally different. Everyone contributes their taxes or their contributions, and everyone receives the benefits of those. So, to mention Scotland again, Scotland was a beneficiary of EU spending. Now you can discuss how effective that was. Of course, aid is sometimes effective, sometimes not. Public spending at the national level is sometimes utterly ineffective, and it's sometimes incredibly effective. So I'm not going to discuss exactly those details now. I'm making the general point that wealthy countries have been net contributors but have received, and poorer countries have been contributors but net recipients. And of course that leads on to the governance. Every country has a seat at the table. It's not that Germany and Britain, when it was a member, and France are making all the decisions about how this money is spent. Of course, they're more powerful, and of course, they will have a large say. But it's about all countries. Romania comes to Brussels to sit at the table to discuss how this money should be spent. Why is that not appropriate for the globe as well, as we become a global village? So that's the analogy, and this is what global public investment is. Concessional international public finance intended to promote sustainable development. It includes ODA, it includes South-South cooperation, but it's much bigger than that. And there's a particular focus on grants, because as we know from the past, even concessional loans, so-called concessional loans, can lead to great levels of indebtedness for poor countries or countries going through economic trouble. So this is a co-creation process. We're still working on it, and we appreciate all your contributions to what the detail looks like and how this idea develops. But that's the broad principle behind it. So here we're on to the 5 paradigm shifts. I have absolutely no idea if I've spoken for 5 minutes or 3 hours. So Geraldine, you're just going to have to kind of interrupt me and tell me depending on how I'm doing. So there are 5 paradigm shifts at the heart of this book, and they are 5 chapters. The first one, I've touched on it already, is about ambition, a paradigm shift in our ambition. It's not just about ending poverty. It's certainly not just about ending extreme poverty. It's not about ending $1 a day poverty or $2 a day, $5 a day. It's not about that. It's about convergence. It's about an ambition for our world whereby all countries can aspire to similar standards of living. And that means elements of redistribution. And it means that this does not end, because you never get to a situation where everything's just fine and dandy. Okay, you're always investing more to keep the countries and the parts of the world that aren't doing so well to help them. So from a focus on growth to a focus on sustainability, at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals is the environment. Wasn't there very significantly in the MDGs, and now, of course, climate change is possibly the most important challenge to humanity. And from national progress alone to international goods, to cross-border, regional, and global goods. And here I just mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. In many ways, that paradigm shift has already been taken, but it hasn't yet been taken by the aid sector, which still sits in that kind of 20th century focus on extreme poverty. And actually, if I'm honest, when I came back from Colombia in 2014 and I started working enthused and excited by the new SDG way of thinking, I came back to Britain and found that a lot of the INGOs and the British government were working against the SDGs. They wanted an MDG+. They wanted the simple poverty focus, and I can understand that, and it's not foolish. I mean, you know, the SDGs is a terrible priority list. It's awful. I mean, it's everything. It's more like the Human Rights Declaration than the MDGs. And yet it is a paradigm shift that was pushed for, especially by the countries of the South, that said, no, it's not just about poverty. This is about building a better world. The second paradigm shift is about the function of concessional international public finance, what I call global public investment. So from quantity to its unique characteristics. So the way we've been taught about aid, and this is why it's posited as temporary. The way we've been talking about aid is some countries have a gap in their finances, and therefore other countries need to kind of put money to fill that hole. If there is other money available, then we don't need aid. It's only for those countries that have these huge gaps. But actually, we would never make that case at the national level. We would never say, oh, well, we need a better health service, so let's just see where we can get money from. If there's tons of private money, that's great. Let's throw that in. If there's tons of Bill Gates money, that's brilliant. Let's get charities involved. And then maybe we won't need any money from the national exchequer. We would never say that, because we know that public money is critical. It's special. It's unique. It has special qualities and characteristics that mean that publicly funded health is different to privately funded health. And yet at the international level, we sometimes fall into this kind of SDG financing gap myth, whereby there's just a hole and we can fill it with whatever money is available. Well, actually, I looked to Mariana Mazzucato as an inspiration here, and she said, look, you know, it's not that the state is just is just kind of overcoming market error. It's actually that state money can be entrepreneurial. It's the first option, the first thought, not just the last resort. Well, so it is also at the international level. International public money can do stuff that other types of money can't. And that's why we still need it, not just for the next 10 years, but for the long haul. So what are the special characteristics of international public finance? Motivation, concessionality, flexibility. It can be counter-cyclical, which means that when every other investor is pulling out of a country, this money could be flowing in. Expertise, the kind of things that people on this call and all around the world bring when they are associated with grants in this sector. Accountability. Yeah, there are problems with accountability, but it's a different kind of accountability. And there's no way, having written a book called The Trouble with Aid 12 years ago, that I'm going to sit here just proclaiming that aid is perfect. It couldn't be less perfect. But it is an important complement to all the other types of totally imperfect monies, such as national public money and private money, totally imperfect, and Gates billionaire money. It's all welcome. It's all imperfect, and it's all complementary. And so this book is saying, stop kind of reducing the importance of international public money. It's crucial. And then I just list a few sectors where it's particularly useful. I won't go into them. And I live in Colombia. I think my wife may have joined this call by now. I'm not sure. If so, hello, darling. So the quote I always use is from an analysis of aid to Colombia in 2011. Aid to Colombia is about 0.2% of GDP. So it's absolutely tiny. It would be described by many people in the aid sector as, quotes, irrelevant. But this analysis says something different. The evaluation of aid to Colombia found that in certain fields, such as the environment, institutional strengthening, and productive system support, as well as problems related to the struggle against inequality, internal displacement, and human rights violations, the selective use of aid financing expertise and shared experience was a determining factor in achieving better development results. Not just a factor, a determining factor in achieving better development results, even though it's a tiny 0.2% of GDP. This is not about quantity alone, although quantity is important. It's about the type of money and the way it can be used in a way that other money couldn't have been. The third paradigm shift. There's like 3 more of these, then there's a couple of other slides, and then it's over. So I think I'm probably doing okay.
So it's about 1:45 now, Jonathan. So we're finishing about 10 past. So maybe if you could wrap up in about 5, that'd be great to give time for questions.
Thank you. Perfect. So the third paradigm shift, also totally underway, but not recognized by the aid paradigm, is that there are no longer simply donors and recipients. You know, again, taking Colombia as an example, it has an aid agency. And one of the directorates is receipts, and one of the directorates is contributions. Most countries in the world now do both. In fact, all countries do both. If you look at the Global Fund, you have contributions from Burkina Faso, from Zimbabwe. All countries are putting their money into regional banks and regional security measures and UN membership fees. The idea that and China and India are the most obvious countries that are both recipients and contributors. And the idea, therefore, that this is north-south, which is still what we tell ourselves in the aid world, certainly formally in the kind of structures, is nonsense. So this idea says no. All countries should contribute, as they are doing, and all countries should receive. There's no graduation, there's gradation. And that's why I bring in the new president of Peru, who happens to be an old friend and worked with us on some of these ideas and came up with this idea of gradation, not graduation, but differentiating the kind of support required according to a different country that you have. I'm going to flick through because I'm a bit late. On governance. So the implication of everyone contributing is that there is a much more democratic governance process, from voluntary to contributory, or trying to be statutory, from unilateral to multilateral, from OECD to the UN and development banks, from states to peoples, so emphasizing the role of civil society, and an enhanced role for the regions. And that's what I've put in this little graphic. We think that there could be a really important role for regions in governing this money. And then finally, and crucially as well, a changed narrative from the idea that aid is a cost to the idea that it's an investment, from this donor recipient idea to membership, from charity to dignity and rights. And you heard Rishi Sunak's speech last week saying we haven't got enough money for charity. Well, it's not about charity. It's about investment in human, in global welfare. It's about investment in ourselves in exactly the same way as it is at the national and the international and the regional level, away from the idea of sending money to foreign parts and towards the idea of investing in our own global and regional good. And that's the president of Ghana who set up this process called Beyond Aid, because you go to any country, especially in Africa, but all over the world, and they will tell you they are so tired of being treated and patronized by the aid narrative. And we all know that, and yet we continue to use it. And I think it's finally time that we should chuck that language in the bin and start a 21st century way of talking about this. So why is GPI suddenly so popular? It's because it's a solution to a problem that is increasingly obvious. We think that the new narrative that I've set out and the new structures that would go with it will lead to more money as countries around the world are re-inspired to engage in this process, and better decision-making as processes are renovated for the 21st century. And you can see that already in the Global Fund. We're in touch with the Vaccine Alliance at CEPI, and there are a number of organizations that already are looking how they can adopt this. And that's what I'm going to come on to now. And these are my final reflections for you in Scotland. We think that Scotland historically always has been at the vanguard of big ideas. And these would be my three, I guess, final remarks in the world of COVID, which I think has changed a lot. Not everything, but a lot. Firstly, think big. We're seeing calls for global government from Gordon Brown, universal basic income from the Spanish, major state intervention again, and finally kind of ridding ourselves of this kind of neoliberal paradigm that's house constrained for most of my lifetime. GPI was radical when I first presented it. Suddenly it feels moderate. Don't think, this is not the moment for small thinking. This is the moment for radical thinking. Second, think public. And I've just mentioned that, you know, the neoliberal paradigm that made us kind of all question the public the whole time. This crisis demonstrates the importance of public funds if it needed to be demonstrated. But why just for COVID? When there's infant mortality around the world, when we're faced with climate change. So while the most important progress on mobilizing resources will be at the national level, absolutely. And private money will help as well. We also need progress on global public investment. And I'm not going to sit here saying it's the only thing that matters, or even that it's the most important thing, but it's an important thing. And we need to cling on to it and improve it for the 21st century. And then finally, take a lead. I always get asked how I think this crisis will play out. And I just say, I have no idea. I've got every call wrong in the last 10 years, from Trump's election to Brexit to the Colombian peace deal that I'm sure you follow closely, Geraldine, to the, and this is important, to after the 2008 crash, when I thought everyone would realize it was a question of regulating the banks better. And what they actually did was vote in all the right-wing parties to deregulate the banks more. So I get this wrong. So for me, the answer is not to try and predict the future. It's to try and take a lead in changing the future. This, I think, is a big moment. Think about the end of the Second World War, when the UN was created, when Keynes came along and put together the Bretton Woods institutions. I think this is a moment, looking especially to 2030, to the next stage after the SDGs, when a brand new, redesigned and remodeled and reinvigorated way of global cooperation can be built. And I would urge Scotland to take a lead in that.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really thought-provoking, and we've got lots of questions. So I'm just going to go straight to the questions. Lots of people wanting to engage. So our first question comes from Kim Byrne. Kim, do you want to unmute yourself and ask away?
Yep. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, thank you. So thank you very much, Jonathan. So as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, there were many partner organizations involved in the group discussion on the future of aid. So my question is, how many of those organizations or organizational bodies are in country-based organizations like NGOs or CSOs? Of course, as it would make sense that the countries themselves should be involved in the discussion of the future of their own aid.
Shall I answer that? Yes,
Go
so
ahead,
Kim,
Jonathan.
absolutely. And the really exciting thing about this process is that it's a co-creation process. So I guess I've been working on this, like I say, for quite a long time. But then about 4 years ago, I got a call from Anton, who I think might be on the call, and Peter Van Rooyen, who's also maybe on the call, who said, look, we actually think your idea could be, we could really work on it. And that's when we really started the process of global consultations. So especially the health civil society movement, so organizations like Global Fund Advocacy Network and other health networks around the world. So over the last 4 years, we've been proposing this, testing it, especially in the global south, especially with civil society organizations. And then this September, in the culmination of all that, we put together this expert working group, which I described, which we made really careful to ensure that it had a good representation of the various different sectors. So bilateral, well, we have one bilateral, which was Norway. We need to get more. But multilaterals and civil society, and from all over the world. So from Africa, Asia, Latin America, as well as Europe and North America. And yeah, the next stage, so this group is going to report, draft report in January, and then we'll continue a further round of especially civil society consultations, especially in the global south. Because the whole point of this, yes, is that the principles, broadly agreed, and people tend to like them, but the actual how does it play out, that's where 1,000 flowers can bloom, and all the ideas that are emerging from the global south are important. And you know, this book is framed as the future of aid. That, I don't know if that was right or not. It could have been called the end of aid. It could not even have mentioned the word aid. This is about international public finance for international solidarity and goods. And that already happens at the regional level in Africa, it already happens in Latin America, it already happens in Asia without any reference to, quotes, aid. So I guess I was focusing this book especially at the kind of aid sector, but really it's about much more than that, and it's about the role of public money at the international level.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Mark O'Donnell, I'm going to go to you. You've got a couple of questions. If you could cover both of them, please, at once.
Unmuted now. Thanks, Geraldine.
Yep, that's you.
Very interesting, Jonathan. Very thought-provoking. A couple of points. Most of what was discussed was around grants, but is there a future role for development banks within a membership and gradation approach? And in the long term, I see a clear need for technical assistance, and I'll tell you why. It took the Metropolitan Police 200 years to do a balance sheet. So one of the reasons that technical assistance, this was an old team leader of mine in Bangladesh, said that the reason technical assistance hasn't worked with the institutions there is because we've only been doing it for 15 years. So I think to develop institutions in country takes a long-term effort and goes well beyond typical 3-year cycles of aid. So there's two parts to that. What is the long-term? What is the long-term assistance to develop institutions, and what role is there for the development banks in there? And the second part, one of the areas that's always a long shadow in ODA is fiduciary risk, always fiduciary risk and risk aversion. So how do we ensure effective, fair and transparent public financial management within individual countries involved in a membership and gradation approach?
So I'm taking that one. Yeah. So, well, that's $1 million question. If I could answer that, I would be an extremely rich person. Let me take your first one first. So, well, there were three really. One was on development banks, one was on technical assistance, and one was on how do you manage risk. So on development banks, absolutely 100%. And I think we're seeing a re-emergence of development banks. The role of lending, both concessional and non-concessional, remains absolutely top priority. And a lot of that money should be public. The reason that I focus on grants is really for one reason. Fundamentally, I'm a campaigner, and there is already within our understanding of quotes aid, and within the northern understanding of the kind of redistribution that is required, there is already this idea that countries will graduate from grants to concessional loans to non-concessional loans. And so if I was to say, look, you know, it's all about it's all about loans as well as grants. Well, that's not really a challenge to the status quo, because that's exactly what Ghana is already preparing itself for. In other words, a move from grants to concessional loans to, and I just use Ghana, it could be any country. So that's why I'm emphasizing the importance of redistribution, not repayable loans with interest or without interest, but actually grant spending, both to the national level and also to support global public goods. With regard to technical assistance, I totally agree, but I would make a challenge to the way we currently do technical assistance. So at the moment, you have people like, you know, brought up in London, going over to Nigeria to help them on conflict resolution as if they've got much to add, which is a bit crazy if you think about it. I mean, you know, of course, we all have stuff that we can contribute, but studying conflict in a university and then becoming a conflict advisor, I'm sure there are billions of conflict advisors here. I don't mean to undermine your work, but there is something odd about that. So what I would recommend is in this way of thinking, a rethinking of what we mean by, or how we do technical assistance, whereby all countries can offer technical assistance to all countries. And I mean South-North. So when I started out here in this business, it was all North-South. And then we started having triangular, of course, and South-South. Well, where's South-North? Is there nothing that experts here in Nigeria can teach the UK, the US, and Europe? Is there nothing that the Latins in the continent where I live can share about their experiences, their way of managing social problems, their way of managing economic challenges, conflict, crime, in managing risk, that can be shared with other countries? We live in this, we've been brought up in the North to believe that we've pretty much got the answers. After all, we're, quote, developed, which is such a patronizing way to think. I don't have a problem actually with the word developing in a way, because we're all developing. The problem I have is with the word developed, because it implies that we've reached the end of the stage where other countries haven't, whereas that's clearly nonsense. Okay, we're all developing. We all need help in a very complex world. And there are, for instance, how do we respond to climate change? There are millions of things that are happening elsewhere in the world that Britain could really benefit from. So yes to technical assistance, but no to North-South technical assistance. Yes to a kind of circular economy of technical assistance. And then the final question about risk, it really is the million-dollar question. I don't have the answer to how can we, after decades of not succeeding, suddenly succeed in clamping down on risk. And there's particularly corruption issues, of course, but also simply just effectiveness issues. The fact is that most countries in the world have high levels of corruption to deal with, whether that's in private business, whether that's in the public sector, quite apart from the aid sector or the international cooperation sector. So I don't think we'll really be able to deal with it. I probably wouldn't say that if I was on telly, but my view is that corruption is pretty endemic most of the world, and you just have to kind of manage it. Obviously, you have to have safeguards. But two things I would say. Firstly, certainly in my experience, when we focus on kind of audits, we're missing a trick. It should be about building trust over the long term with organizations and people, which the best NGOs do. And if we rely on audits, we're always going to get played. And the second thing is to think of this more as, not totally as, but more as the way that venture capitalists think about their investments. So you had Andrew Mitchell leading the charge on the idea that we're going to count every penny of every pound. Okay, it sounds good, but it's not actually very sensible. Venture capitalists make money off 25% of their investments, and they make a lot of money off that. 75% of their investments, therefore, are, quotes, wasted. So as an investment didn't come off. That's at least how the aid sector would see it as wasted. Of course, venture capitalists don't see it like that at all. So I would like us to move away from this kind of heavy pounds and dollars approach and results approach towards a more realistic look. We know all our investments are not going to be successful. I know that's very hard to share with the general public, but maybe it's time to begin the process of treating the public with more respect and being more honest about the challenges that I think are endemic, and I can't see, certainly in my lifetime, kind of dealing with them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right, I've got loads of questions about how it works. So I'm going to just go through quite a lot of them, bunch them all together, and you can see how you choose to answer them. So some of them are, where does emergency aid fit within this new approach? So moving from poverty eradication to inequality, etc. Then we have, how do you envisage it being managed and supported? And how would you respond to the charge that it could be seen as effectively promoting one world government with all the very real risks to efficiency, democracy, responsiveness, local accountability, and liberal values that this could generate? Then we have, GPI is in the opposite direction to the road being taken by the FCDO. Is the discourse powerful enough, and does it have enough in it to demonstrate self-interest to the global north to persuade agencies like FCDO to think again? Then abusing chair privilege a little bit, does the concept accept the need for degrowth in the north, linked to that bit about moving from growth to sustainability? So I think that's quite a good bunch there for you. So if you could do your best to answer them, that'd be great. Okay,
so take them in order. So where's emergency aid fit in? It just fits. But I think what we would be, but all the principles of GPI would apply. So firstly, we would try and make it much more statutory. So it is crazy at the moment that, you know, whenever there's an emergency, you have to kind of go around with a begging bowl. The idea would be that all countries are paying into a statutory, in a somewhat statutory, actually unenforceable, but I guess exemplary peer pressure way to support a standing emergency fund. That would try to make monies in emergency, but in all the sectors, more stable, more predictable, which is another major problem we have currently in ODA. And let's also just mention aid orphans, which is a crazy situation if you think about it. The idea that some countries are simply not getting as much money as they require, basically because the donor countries are not organizing themselves in what would be the most simple way to ensure that money is spent in a sensible way to cover the various countries around the world. That's been decades and total failure on that from what I can see. So that's the first thing. And the second way that, you know, the principles of GPI would apply to emergency. Actually, I can give you an example. I don't know if it has actually happened, but I was presenting this down in Australia earlier this year. Wow, just before COVID hit. And they were talking about building a humanitarian fund for Asia Pacific. And they were like, well, how can we do it according to GPI rather than according to the ODA approach? And so what would the ODA approach have done? It would have said, right, who are the donors here? Well, you've got Australia and New Zealand, basically. Who are the recipients? Well, you've got Indonesia, Solomon Islands, maybe southern India, the various recipient countries. And you'd set up your humanitarian fund, and the governance would follow the kind of money. But a GPI approach would be very different. It says all countries in that group would put money in, and all countries would sit around the table to work out how that money most effectively ought to be spent. And yes, even Australia could receive money. And in fact, of course, Australia, while I was there, was receiving money from poorer countries, from Indonesia, even offered money from the Solomon Islands, by the Solomon Islands, during the wildfire crisis in Australia. And this demonstrates how the world has changed and how the donor-recipient model is no longer sensible, and how a all contribute, all receive model is a much more sensible way of doing things. And some people think it sounds radical. Other people just say, well, it's already happening. And it is already happening. Most of the stuff that I'm saying here is already emerging. And it's just a question of helping it, pushing it through, helping the birth of a new approach and kind of clawing away at the barriers. So how would it be managed? And would it lead to a kind of one world government? Well, no. And that's where the analogy with the European Union falls apart completely. There are some things to be learnt from national level spending, and there are some things to be learnt from regional level spending, such as in unions like the European Union. But certainly I wouldn't be suggesting any kind of world government. I think that the way that I would think about it would be something like this. The UK would have to reach its statutory 0.7%, or I would say 1%, given that we need to do much more than just what ODA has done traditionally, and we need to respond to global public goods. And maybe, you know, a percentage of that percent, so, you know, 50% of that might be given bilaterally. 30% might be spent through multilateral funds, global fund, new funds to deal with new things. 20% might be spent on research, 5% might be spent on research within Britain. I don't know. There's a lot of co-creation still abounding, but I'm much more of the view that you know, the answer is not some kind of committee to work everything out, especially in terms of delivery, but rather let 1,000 flowers bloom. But yes, it would require some kind of oversight at the international level. And this is where I recognize, I don't know if it's Simon Reed Henry's on this call, but he's done a lot of thinking around that and really taken our thinking forward. And yeah, you know, in the same way as you've kind of got the DAC overseeing ODA, but without actually mandating how it's spent, well, I think at the UN you would need to have basically someone with a calculator working out that, yeah, if Sierra Leone, and that's what I'm proposing, by the way, the poorest countries in the world go ahead and put in 1% of their GDP into global objectives, well, they have to make sure they receive a hell of a lot of that, a lot more than that back. So someone's got to be working that out, and that's where I say, you know, this issue of aid orphans hopefully would be diminished. So yeah, you need some bureaucracy without a shadow of a doubt to make this work. Is the FCDO kind of too far gone to get this? Well, I mean, let's not be naive. You know, the kind of things that certainly I have as my ideals and my vision for a better world, I don't think are shared by the current British government, and I don't think that the FCDO global spending on global public goods, I'll be quite honest. Nevertheless, there are some things that you can kind of salvage from this wreck. And actually, one of the best things about global public investment is it does appeal to your fairly radical civil society movements. Absolutely. It also could appeal to the right wing. And yes, I do think it responds to the idea that it's in our own national interest. Because, you know, Rishi Sunak should not get away with with standing up in the Commons and saying we haven't got enough money for this charity. And that's because we have allowed, as a sector, the idea that this is charity. That's the narrative that he's speaking. You know, it's not charity. It should be a statutory contribution to our own well-being as part of a community of nations. You know, put it in whatever narrative or language best works in whatever particular context. So it is in our national interests in the long term. And I think even we could think of ways, and I've implied this, that money could come back to the UK and be spent on things that we care about. And yeah, some of the money should be spent in UK universities. Why not? And the UK Space Agency. I'm not against that kind of creative thinking personally, because certainly other countries are doing it. And then finally on degrowth, I am going to duck that question just because I haven't read enough about it. It certainly seems to me like a really sensible idea. I don't see why theoretically wealthy countries need to continue to grow. Clearly they do in our current model, but there's no reason not to think of a different model. But I'm afraid I'm just too ignorant on that subject to give you a sensible answer.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time together. I think it's been incredibly rich. So thank you so much